is on Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss with Tal Raz, and the presentation is by me, Christina Cardesano. Quick disclaimer, I am a little sick, so I'm sorry if I sound a little funny. Who is Chris Voss? He's a former lead international kidnapping negotiator for the FBI. And I basically picked this quote just because I thought it fit nice with explaining the first chapter, the new rules, and the idea that negotiation is universally applicable. And that Chris Voss basically talks about how the skills that he developed within working for the FBI still worked even if he was negotiating with Harvard professors. And that there's always going to be this emphasis on empathy, listening to the wants and needs of your counterpart, and trying to really understand your counterpart. Chapter 2, Be a Mirror. You want to question the assumptions of others, so anything that your counterpart holds true, you want to question that. And in doing so, you need to remain more open, and you have to keep in mind that the negotiation is not a battle, it's a process of discovery. You're trying to learn as much as possible about your counterpart, and to do so, you need to focus on the other person. What are their wants? What are their needs? And you need to listen and validate. And that builds trust, which is really important. In doing so, you're going to use 3 different voice tones. The late night FM DJ voice to make a point. The positive, playful voice is like your default when you're negotiating. And then the direct or assertive voice, you don't want to use too much because it actually can tear away at the trust that you already built, which is kind of self-explanatory if someone's being really direct or assertive with you. And then the last tip was repeat the last 3 words that your counterpart says. And in doing so, you basically are bonding with them. You develop a little bit of a bond. Don't feel their pain, label it. And this is focusing on it's focusing on tactical empathy and labeling. So tactical empathy is trying to understand the feelings and mindset of your counterpart to use later in the negotiation. So you want to validate the emotions of your counterpart by acknowledging them. Labeling negatives diffuses, while labeling positives reinforce. So in order to detect the emotional state, which is the first thing that you need to do, you need to hone in on your neural resonance skills. So observing their face, their gestures, their tones, and so forth. And that helps with specifically detecting the emotional state. So after you've detected it, what it is, you want to say it out loud, but you want to say it in a certain way. It seems like, it sounds like, it looks like, blah, blah, blah. And it's important to say it like this. It's just because you may be wrong. And if you are wrong, then you could say, well, I only said that it seems. I didn't say that it was. And then after you've said it out loud, excuse me, you want to be silent. And then you want to listen to find the reason behind the emotion, because that information can be important for the negotiation later. Beware yes, master no. Let's start with no, because it's the starting point. It can mean multiple things, so it's actually kind of better to get your counterpart to say it earlier in the negotiation rather than later, because it kind of helps make them feel like they're in control. And people apparently have a natural tendency to want to say no anyway. So you don't want them just to simply agree with you anyway, because you want them to think that your goal is their own, because people tend to follow things that they think they came up with themselves. Moving on to yes, there's 3 types of yeses. Counterfeit, which is basically just the easier route. They're just saying it just because it's the easiest thing to say. Confirmation, simple affirmation with no promise of action. They're basically saying it, but they don't really mean it. And then the commitment is that's the true agreement. That's when they sign the contract. They actually have really bought into what you're trying to convince them of. So the goal is to get a commitment yes. Trigger the 2 words that immediately transform any negotiation. So we kind of just talked about yes, but that's right is actually better than a yes. And it creates breakthroughs, and that's kind of why you want to hear that's right over yes. And to trigger that response, you're going to use a summary of what was said. Bend their reality. It's important to be fair. You want to be known, you want to have a reputation as being fair. But in order to bend the reality of your counterpart, you want to start with anchoring their emotions. And this is kind of when you throw out all of their potential losses so that they'll become fearful of losing, and they're going to try to counteract that. Let the other guy go first most of the time. And this is just because they might have had a better offer than what you've thought in your head anyway. Establish a range. So if you're worth X amount, you want to say you're worth somewhere between X and probably higher than what you're actually worth. Pivot to non-monetary terms. So maybe throw in something that it's non-monetary. It's probably not important to you, but they might want it. It might be important to them. When you do talk numbers, use odd numbers. So don't use the number 5,000. Use the number 4,993. And the reason for that is because when you use a specific number like that, it makes it seem like you really tried hard to calculate it. It's been really thoughtful, even though it might not have been. And then last but not least, surprise with the gift. And it kind of just makes you seem like you're so generous. Next is create the illusion of control. And you're going to do that with calibrated questions. Calibrated questions are basically when you're educating the counterpart about the problem without having to cause like a conflict by directly saying it, like cause conflict between you and the person you're negotiating with. And this is when you're going to use how or what questions. And then I put 2 examples. What about this is important to you? How can I help to make this better for us? And this basically makes your counterpart feel like they're in control. But in reality, you're framing the conversation. And you're framing the conversation in the direction that will end up solving your problem specifically. But the whole time, they're going to think that they're in control and they're the ones who are making all these decisions. Guarantee execution. This is the use of how questions, but specifically to shape the answer of your counterpart. You want to convince them that the final solution is their idea. Like what we said earlier, you will follow things that you think that you've created yourself. So some examples of those questions would be, how will we know we're on track? Or how will we address things if we find we're off track? And then there are also some other tactics. The 7-38-55% rule is basically that idea that when you are talking, only 7% of what you say is the words alone, 38% is the tone of voice, and 55% is body language in your faces you make. This is actually very important because when you're negotiating with someone, you want to actually pay close attention to those things and make sure that they're lining up. Because if they don't line up, it might actually mean that your counterpart is lying. The next one is the rule of 3. It's a very simple idea that if your counterpart agrees to the same thing 3 times, then they probably really bought into whatever they're agreeing to. Next is the Pinocchio effect. And this is the idea that liars are going to say a lot more words, say a lot more things than someone who's telling the truth. And they're also going to use more third-person pronouns compared to someone who's telling the truth. And this is important also, again, to take note of, because you want to know if the person you're negotiating with is lying. And then last but not least, the Chris discount is the fact that people tend not to want to keep hearing their own name over and over again. So it might be beneficial not to say it as much, and maybe to even start off by saying your own name. Next is bargain hard. If the negotiation is going nowhere, you need to shake things up. And you also want to use the Ackerman model. This is where you set your target price, set your first offer at 65% of your target price, calculate 3 raises of decreased increments. So for example, 85, 95, 100%. And you want to use empathy and different ways of saying no before increasing. So the tactics that we talked about earlier, you want to use that before you just immediately start increasing. Use precise numbers, not rounded numbers. Like mentioned before, precise numbers make it seem like you put more thought into the calculation. And then at your final offer, throw in a non-monetary item to show that you're at your limit. So basically you're throwing in something to be like, oh, this is all I have left. Like, please, like, I'm done. Like, this is all I got. And then when you're negotiating, it's also important to identify your counterpart's style. And this is just so that you can know how you want to approach them. So the 3 styles is accommodator, assertive, and analysis. Last but not least is find the black swan. So black swan is basically information that you don't already know that could alter the negotiation in your favor. So you want to use what you already know to guide what you don't already know. And you want to do such to gain leverage. And this is basically where you persuade your counterpart they have something real to lose. So you're gaining leverage to make them think that if they lose, like, it would be very bad for them. So positive leverage is the ability to provide, so the things that you can give to your counterpart. Negative leverage is the ability to make your counterpart suffer. And then normative leverage is using your counterpart's norms and beliefs to make it seem as though what they're saying is contradictory.